It's the real news. I'm Aaron Mate. Tuesday was election day in the U.S., and 1 year after that same day gave us President Donald Trump, this year's election brought many victories for those who oppose his agenda. Democrats won the gubernatorial races in New Jersey and Virginia. They also took back the Washington state legislature and are on the brink of doing so in the Virginia House of Delegates, pending a recount. Tuesday also saw progressive victories in closely watched races for state positions. Larry Krasner, a civil rights attorney who wants to end mass incarceration, will be Philadelphia's new district attorney. Krasner is one of many candidates backed by the Democratic Socialists of America who came out victorious on Election Day. Joining me is Zaid, Jilani, a reporter for The Intercept. His latest piece is called "A Year After Trump, Democrats, Socialists, and Populists Sweep Elections." Welcome, Zaid. Your sense of what happened on Tuesday, can this be seen as a big victory for Democrats over Trump?
Yeah, I think, there was a big question sort of looming after the election of President Trump. That question was, could he build a sustainable coalition, or will his presidency turn a lot of people off and generate a backlash? And it seems like what we saw last night was sort of the second. A lot of eyes were on Virginia. And it's true that Democrats already held all the statewide offices in Virginia. They won statewide in 2016. However, something very unexpected happened, which was that they actually appear, as you mentioned earlier, they appear to be on the verge of winning control of the House of Delegates. Now, the day before yesterday, Democrats held 34 out of 100 seats, I think, in the House of Delegates. So you can see how big of a change that is. There were a lot of sort of stable, long-term Republican incumbents who were defeated in that state. And then part of it, my colleague Lee Fong and I, we went out to some of the polls and talked to voters. And I think part of it is sort of a reaction to President Trump. I think a lot of people felt like he and the Republican Party were not governing very well. And so they wanted to respond to that. And I think there was also somewhat of a backlash to what Ed Gillespie, the Republican gubernatorial candidate, was doing towards the end of the race. He started airing a lot of ads about MS-13, which is this sort of a Hispanic-dominated gang that has a small presence in Virginia. He was airing ads, related to Confederate statues, and I think he was really running, a fearful campaign. And it's interesting, at the very end of the night, Lee and I stopped by a young Republican party, where they were sort of watching election results, and one of them even told us, "Yeah, I think those ads were really stupid, and I think it's a big mistake." And I think that's really a reckoning for the Republican Party, right? Can they keep running the same old playbook and think that that's an excuse, that's an alternative to having real policies that help people and that move their states, their cities, and the country forward?
Right. I mean, Ed Gillespie in Virginia essentially ran a Trump-style race-baiting campaign, but he didn't openly embrace Trump. He sort of kept his distance from him. But let me ask you, I mean, the Democratic candidate, Ralph Northam, in his acceptance speech, he was protested by immigrant rights activists over his opposition to sanctuary cities. I mean, I think it's fair to say, correct me if I'm wrong, that he's not quite a progressive stalwart.
No, I mean, he had voted for George Bush twice. He admitted that. He was more or less the favored son of the Democratic Party in the primary race. In the primary race, he was up against another gentleman named Tom Perriello, who's a little bit more of a progressive record, comes from the progressive movement, has done a lot of international NGO work. And Perriello was soundly defeated in that race. And, it was largely seen as sort of the Democratic establishment, McAuliffe establishment, sort of standing up for their guy and bringing Northam forward. So I think, that's the other interesting thing is that when we went out and talked to voters yesterday, every voter we talked to who was opposed to the Republicans, I don't think a single one, and we talked to many, said anything positive about Northam. I don't think this was really about Northam. Like I said, I think that he's kind of maintaining the status quo in Virginia because they already held the governor's office. What was sort of more interesting and impressive was we saw a lot of sort of young people who had never been involved in politics before winning races in the House of Delegates, which is the legislature. And I think that was sort of a less covered story that is a little bit more interesting than the Democrats sort of keeping the governor's mansion by basically advocating for status quo.
Yeah, Zed, let's talk about one of them in Virginia. Lee Carter, he was backed by the Democratic Socialists, ran as a Democrat, received no help from the state Democratic Party, but he still won.
Yeah, so Lee Carter actually he did get a little bit of help at the tail end. I think there was like a mailer or something. It was a small amount of money from the Democratic Party. But basically, what happened was he was running against, for instance, there's like a lot of energy monopolies in Virginia. There are a number of companies that people protest, saying that they basically have carte blanche to raise rates and things like that. And he was very strongly opposed to them. And the Democratic Party is sort of, on the one hand, on the other about those sort of things. Northam, for instance, refused to distance himself from a number of the sort of fossil fuel, utilities in the state. But he was very opposed to them. So actually, I think after he won the Democratic primary, because he was running as a Democrat, for the most part, they didn't really help him. They didn't really send people out to his district or anything like that. And he sort of built his campaign off small donations and just local support. And yeah, actually, the Republican that he defeated last night was no small fish either. I mean, this was the Republican whip in the House of Delegates. So one of the senior people in Republican leadership was the person he defeated. And, he openly ran his campaign saying that he doesn't really think the Democrats or the Republicans are doing a whole lot standing up for the issues that he was running on, pro-worker issues, pro-environment issues. And so his win it was an extreme surprise. I don't think anyone thought that district was even vulnerable to anyone. But now we have a young guy who's an openly democratic socialist person. And I'm sure we'll see a lot from him going forward to see how he serves as the first socialist lawmaker in the Virginia legislature.
Also, some surprising victories for Democratic Socialists at the local level in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, so we saw, I think it was the 31st district there, we have a sort of a judicial position elected, a guy who unseated a 24-year incumbent Democrat as an independent candidate running very strong criminal justice reform on restorative justice, which is very interesting in that state. I think we're seeing a lot of movement on the issue because also this was in Pittsburgh, in neighboring Philadelphia, we saw Larry Krasner is going to take office as DA. Krasner won his Democratic primary a few months ago, so he was considered sort of a shoe-in last night because the Republicans aren't very competitive in Philadelphia. But Krasner truly is a radical. He's very strongly opposed to the death penalty. He had represented Black Lives Matter protesters. I believe he'd also represented Occupy protesters, or at least he was supportive of it. Certainly, he's probably the most left-wing DA of any major city in America. And this is in Philadelphia, which is not a city known for having, robust criminal justice reform. It has had quite a bit of police abuse, quite a bit of incarceration. So that was truly, that's truly going to be something I think everyone in the country is going to be watching, and probably people from other countries, probably globally, people will be watching the sort of reforms he can enact in Philadelphia, and if he can really move it away from sort of a judicial and administrative state that focuses very heavily on incarceration as a response to social problems.
Let's go to some of what Larry Krasner said upon his victory last night.
If you, like us, believe it's time to end the death penalty, if you believe it's time to end mass incarceration, if you believe it's time to stop making prisoners for poor people by using cash bail.
So that's Larry Krasner, who will be Philadelphia's next district attorney. Zaid, let's talk about where progressives fell short. In Ohio, there was a really big campaign involving the pharmaceutical industry, a referendum on drug price control. Pharmaceutical companies spent something like $60 million to have it defeated, and they prevailed. Can you talk about what happened there?
Yeah, so actually this was a sort of a mirror ballot referendum to what happened in California last year. So in both cases, what happened was the AIDS Foundation, which works very heavily on HIV/AIDS drugs, access to them. Basically what they did is they sponsored an amendment saying the state Medicaid program, they'd basically lock in and negotiate prices for drugs, similar to how, let's say, like the veteran U.S. federal government level. In both cases, we saw enormous spending by the industry to defeat that referendum. In California, it was really interesting. You even had a lot of civil rights groups and sort of LGBT groups come out against it because, unfortunately, many of them were soliciting money from the industry as well. And actually, the defeat last night in Ohio is much more extreme than in California, I believe the referendum went down something like 2080. And that's what happens when you have an industry spend $60 million on a referendum in a state where there were some local elections last night, but there weren't really any major elections beyond that. That's how much money they can throw in a complete off-year election where nothing else is happening. So you can imagine the kind of funds they might generate if other things are going on that help drive their vote. And so unfortunately, that we've seen two very strong, pushes by the drug industry in, I guess, the past year now to defeat drug pricing control. And if you'll remember, President Trump himself campaigned on reforms in that area on, for instance, I think letting Medicare negotiate drug prices. And that's something he's completely backed off of. And that's also something, where we see votes in the U.S. Senate about drug reimportation. We see big losses there. So I think, that's one of the spots where we need to start looking seriously and see if there is actually a path around the power of this industry, because they consistently win and they almost never lose any of these political fights, whether it's in legislatures or whether it's in ballot referendums.
There were a lot of people rooting for Jabari Bridgeport, a Green Party socialist running for council. He fell short. You profiled him for The Intercept. Your thoughts on his race and what it says about the challenge of, translating the growing momentum, the growing membership of the Democratic Socialists of America, translating that into electoral victories?
Yeah, so I think, Bridgeport was a candidate who I had interviewed over the summer and profiled over the summer. And, he ran a very strong and spirited campaign on issues related to housing affordability and gentrification, which is something I think that you saw as an issue in many municipal elections last night. And I think, the main challenge here is that we saw quite a bit of a backlash against Republicans last night. And I think socialists and populist candidates did benefit from some of that. We saw a number of them elected last night. But I think the issue with what happened in Bridgeport's race, what happened in some other neighboring races, was that the Democratic establishment itself is still fairly strong. And organizing people against a party that's right now receiving the benefits of a backlash against Republicans and Trump is a little bit more difficult because, this is a party that not every day are there, not every day does Jabari Bridgeport's opponent, tweet something stupid or was on TV saying something obnoxious or, to organize against candidates like that, against Democratic establishment candidates in places like New York or Seattle or Atlanta, you have to do a lot of mobilizing of voters. And I think, to some extent, Jabari was a first-time candidate. He was a third-party candidate as a Green Party candidate. And he actually received more votes than I think any third-party candidate for a city council race in like a decade. So certainly he beat everyone else last night who did that. Probably beat most of the Republican candidates who ran for city council races last night. So I think, and to some extent, he was actually, he can take, I think, a lot of pride in the robustness of his campaign, and the DSA can. This was one of two candidates the DSA backed the city council races. The other one did not survive their primary. They lost by 7 percentage points a couple months back. But I think this is sort of a growing pain for DSA. Normally this organization has been around for decades. It has not really engaged in electoral politics at all. Now it's starting to. It has some successes and it has some failures, but I think even the failures, they're learning a lot, and they're getting a fair and decent amount of votes, much more than socialist candidates and third-party candidates would have in the past. So I think, in that sense, they can take heart from that experience. But they should understand that there's still things to learn, and that the establishment they're fighting there is actually at this moment in history, fairly stronger to them and outmatches them in a lot of these local races.
Let's talk about the Democrats overall. They've lost something like 1,000 seats since at the state level since President Obama's first term. They've lost the House, the Senate, and the White House. After their gubernatorial victory in Virginia last night, the DNC chair, Tom Perez, declared Democrats are back. His job was said to be on the line if they had lost Virginia. Do you agree that the Democrats are back, and your thoughts on their prospects heading into next year's elections, the midterms in 2018?
Yeah. So in our system where there's two parties control most of the seats, when one party is sort of hurting, and in this case the Republican Party is not governing very well, the other party tends to benefit. Now, here's the question: does that mean that Tom Perez is doing his job well, the Democrats are doing their job well? Not necessarily. If it's largely about a backlash to the Republicans, and the true question is if there is a backlash, if you take power due to a backlash, do you govern well, or are you yourself going to be the victims of a backlash? I mean, that certainly happened in 2010. After 2008, Democrats had like near historic amounts of control. It had been decades since they had that much control, and by 2010 voters judged their governing, poorly, and they saw, tremendous losses. And then that continued through 2016 to where, Republicans almost had enough power in state legislatures to rewrite the entire Constitution. Perez obviously, his job is to be a pitchman for the Democrats and to protect his own job. But saying that they are beneficiaries of a backlash against the Republicans right now is very different than saying that as a party it's functioning well or that it's governing well. And especially placing so much of that on Northam is a little bit unusual because Northam is simply another Democrat taking the governor's seat in Virginia, where they did win statewide last year and where they already had the governor's seat. So that's a little bit, less of an achievement. I think probably more of an achievement if Democrats were to win statewide in states like Georgia, in states like Texas next year, because those are states where they have not been in power for decades, or more than a decade. And that would take, I think, a little bit more electoral, ingenuity than simply holding on to a seat you already had in Virginia, which I think is mostly what Perez was referring to.
We'll leave it there. Zaid Jilani, reporter for The Intercept. His latest piece is A Year After Trump, Democrats, Socialists, and Populists Sweep Elections. Zaid, thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News.